tonight's guest. So, Chad Cribbins. Chad is a father first, and a designer, and a builder second, and that order matters to what he is working on. He spent 25 years in design and technology, leading teams around the world as a founder, product owner, creative director. New to Lisbon, he's now building Embers, a learning platform built around one question. What if school felt personal and human again? I like that. Embers runs on focused 2 hours, 2 hour AI tutoring blocks with real mentors in the room, deep experts joining remotely, and kids learning next to other kids. So less factory, more workshop. The children, they build real projects, keep a portfolio, and get to be capable, creative, and a bit more free. Chad cares most about where AI actually helps people, and he puts education and health at the top of the list. He's also been to about 70 plus countries, so expect a story or two. I'm holding you accountable on that, man. Tonight, he'll share the personal reason behind Embers, why so many families feel the current school model is broken, and where he thinks education goes from here. 1 hour of talk, then questions and open debate. Come with opinions. Chad, the stage is yours.
All right, dudes. Cool. So I'm going to repurpose a little bit of a talk I did recently. We had, it was kind of funny. We had a little event that got signed up, and I was hoping for maybe 5, 10 parents, and it sort of ballooned out of control and got up to around 40. And then lucky the Portugal game was going, so it actually dropped back down to 20, which was about manageable. And so I'll be kind of reusing that deck, but it should illuminate the core messages we're trying to get into. So kind of be in 4 different stages. We'll look at the personal story on why and how Embers kind of came to be. We'll get into a little bit of what I think is broken and, the challenges with current model and some ways around that. Hopefully a little bit of an aha moment and some thoughts about what we think would make a significant impact and a change for that. And then normally I'll do the ask, and that's just kind of getting folks involved and figuring out who wants to kind of help and support. So kind of to step it all back, like how in the heck did I end up in Lisbon, Portugal in general? It's a classic story, a classic boy meets girl. So country boy from Oregon meets lovely girl from Ahmedabad, Gujarat. And we had this simple little plan. We were just going to move to London for a couple of years and do some traveling. And then 20 years later, we sort of look around and was like, what in the hell happened? I've got 3 little kids with hardcore East London accents, saying like thing. And I had to, explain to my kids there's no F in the word thing. Come on, boys, let's get this correct. But it definitely all happened very wonderfully unplanned. So what was going to be, a few years ended up to be kind of starting a whole life and family in another country. And all was well in East London. We loved Hackney. It was a great place to raise young little ones until we hit secondary school. And so this was really the stumbling block. We kind of moved heaven and earth to get Maya into a pretty well recognized school called Mossbourne Vicky Park. And we'd heard some of the rumors that might be a little bit strict, but Maya likes kind of guardrails and, she wants a little bit of structure. And so we're like, it'll be fun. It'll be great. But I do remember being in one of the assemblies where the principal was standing at the top, and sort of reminds me of the story you were saying, Miko. And he basically just said, while we appreciate parents, we're not interested in your opinion. We're the professionals and we know the best way to go. I kind of looked at me and I was like, whoa, that's a bit hardcore for a first intro dance. At least take me out to dinner first. Jeez. So right from the get, we knew we were in for a bit of a bumpy ride. But, the school on paper looked really good. I'd met some kids. So we were going to ride it and see what would happen. Unfortunately, that dream turned into a little bit of a nightmare. So Mossbourne effectively was all stick and very little carrot. So much that they were written in The Guardian on multiple different times. They had articles in BBC where people were basically coming up and saying, you harmed my children. About 150 parents signed a petition saying that there was nothing but fear and kind of bullying in this school. And it took on a very, it's a bit of an undertone in some of the British schools right now of this very strict authoritarian rules. So as an example, there's a one-way entry system into the school. So when you kind of go in, if you miss your class, then you have to go back out to the school and go again. Or there's no touching of any other kids. So you can't go and hug your buddy and high five anybody in the hallways. There's no talking in the hallways. So there's just orderly conduct, walk in a straight line, go to your class, shut up, sit down, listen. So Maya got a detention, for instance, for asking what the date was, because it was clearly on the board. She would get a detention if you dropped a pencil and didn't ask for permission. It was so punitive. At some point, you were just kind of scratching your head going, what is your end objective? What are you trying to do here? And to some extent, there's that theory of like, well, we're going to break these kids down to build them back up. And I don't even think that's a great approach. But if you were to do that, I just wasn't really preview to the building back up. There was a lot of breaking down, but very little building back up. So this became bad. Maya got pretty unhealthy on the back of that. We had to go get some professional help, and things definitely went a bit dark. And so it was a moment where, Nancy and I kind of sat back and was like, okay, what's the plan here? And okay, maybe we did something a little drastic and decided to move to a whole other country, but we knew we needed to do something different. And my boys, bless them, Maya's my tough one, and my boys are like tissue. So like if she was getting destroyed in this thing, they would have just gotten obliterated. So we definitely had to make a change. And this wasn't the only time the system has let me and my family down. So as a young lad, I was in a pretty challenging school and grade school as well. So I had amblyopia and a pretty severe amount of dyslexia. So I had a patch over my eye, and I had a school that didn't really know how to handle that difference. So much so that they would effectively put me kind of out in the back in the porta potty cabins with other kids with severe disabilities. So it got pretty weird. And my grandparents kind of blazed into town, and they said, "Okay, we're gonna pull Chatty out." And so grabbed a garbage bag, threw a bunch of clothes in a bag, threw me in the car, and said, "We're taking Chatty," and left for a really remote part of Oregon. And in that remote part, I ended up kind of getting super lucky and starting this amazing school that had 2 teachers in the whole entire school. It's kind of a one roof town. And you basically taught the kids below you, and the kids above you taught you. And so this school probably saved my life. And this was at a very young age, and instilled confidence back into me, and they invested in you. And, it was just an incredibly progressive school for the 80s. So it was small enough to really kind of just be seen, be challenged, really have some authorities that actually knew who you were and understood you, and then just to give you an immense amount of freedom, which was an incredible thing at a very young age. So those are kind of the 2 instances that definitely led to us kind of thinking, all right, there needs to be some sort of difference in a change, and a big, huge factor of that was us moving to Lisbon. And this is us kind of plugging into the Lisboan, which has been an incredible space for my kids. So Maya, that first week of school, turned around to me. She said, "That was the greatest first week of school I had in my life, Papa." And so, I think we made a pretty good decision. But that's definitely one of the things that sort of got, the head ticking, and to think, where we're going to go with that. And speaking for Sunil also has 2 lovely daughters, the same as Sasson and Maya, my 2 oldest kids. And he's been struggling with some similar things with his kids and their education, and how can they get supported. So these are definitely deeply intrinsic sort of passions and beliefs that we think there needs to be a different approach. So what is that? What do we think is broken? As I kind of alluded to, I think in this industrial factory where you're kind of cranking through grade by grade, the reality is there's some pretty core missing foundations, right? So if you're a 6th grade kid and you're reading at a 3rd grade level, it doesn't really matter. You're moving on to 7th grade, and tough if you really can't keep up. That, they just kind of keep that wheel cranking. So nobody really understands where the gaps are and how to close that. And then the ceiling, like there's too many kids that are very sharp, and sometimes get pegged as the bad kid or the disruptive kid, and more often than not, it's just because they're bored, and they don't feel like there's any ability for them to kind of exercise their curiosity and do something interesting. So, the floor is kind of missing, and the ceiling has been capped at a pretty low level. So this is one of those stats that's super controversial, but I love it. It was a study done out of NASA, I think back in the 80s, where they went through and tested what was on some level of genius for particular groups of folks. So at age 5, most of the folks were testing in the 98th percentile for what they qualified as a genius. And then as you moved on to age 15, that kind of totally collapsed to about 12%. And then when you get into the adulthood, that number was registering around 2%. So effectively, this system that we've got our kids in is training creativity out of our children, which is tragic but true. So the answer has always been one-to-one. So this is Bloom's famous 2 sigma problem. The fix on education is to have a one-to-one tutor, and if you're part of the royal family, then that's a total possibility. But for the rest of us mere mortals, that just isn't a scalable possibility. So that is the solution. And I think we are now entering in a phase where this technology is allowing us to kind of do some of that. So why now? So I believe that we are now moving into this age of agentic realm where you can have these things be involved in your kids' education, and they can deeply and intimately understand each of your children. They are infinitely patient. They will be asked the same question multiple different ways and never get annoyed with it. They'll just keep on respinning and figuring out a different way to try to explain the context of what they're trying to get at. So we're moved from this notion of like impossible to scale to kind of this kind of quaint idea of a kind of a smart tutor to now possibly this notion of agentic teams where we have multiple different systems that are swarming around you, and for a long duration, a long time horizon, you can have a system that gets more and more intimate around who you are. So as I said, evidence is pretty interesting. You've got Bloom, you've got Kensington, who recently has done some really interesting research showing that the AI tutoring can outperform a real setting with some limits, and what those limits are pretty strict pedagogical guidelines. And so understanding really how you want to structure the education. So it's different than just to say a chatbot or just even jumping on Claude. Having something in the whole harness that allows the kids to really be steered and navigated in a very specific way is really important. So that's one of the things we've been thinking deeply about, and how to kind of take that Socratic approach, how to ask questions. But you'll see there's some thresholds we want to make sure we're falling into. Another interesting thing is the International Baccalaureate is moving away from exams to some extent. I mean, there will always be some level of exams, but they are now realizing that what's really actually important is portfolios, proof of work, and collaboration, with a huge amount of sort of focus and impact on what a community impact would be. So how do you have real impact for real people? This most aligns to what we're trying to build. So there's a lot of things within IB that I love. I love the breadth. I think when you're a young mind, you need to taste as many different flavors of education as possible. So trying to get kids deep exposure to a broad set of things is probably more important than going very, very deep in a very specific area. Because at some point in time, you might not know that there's a part or an industry or a subject out there that really tickles something you're really curious about as a kid. And so exposure is the answer to that. And so in the system that we're dreaming up, you're going to have the ability to have much more exposure. My daughter was signing up for the IGSCs, and she's got to pick particular different classes, and she can have PE, but she can't have PE and science. And there's like these weird clashes, and you're like, why? That doesn't make any sense. And they're trying to deal with the human scale problem, but in general, there's also just this challenge that they think there's a limited sort of thing of where, you can't put art and science together. God forbid you do that. You're either a scientist or an artist. And so I think that cleaving off of where kids project pedagogical sort of pathway is a flaw, and I think there's ways to fix that. The other big thing we're going to get a lot of pressure with is around screen time. So people are like, I don't want my kid plugged into the Borg. Totally agree with that. We're pretty strict family around screen time as well. So I totally appreciate the evidence is overwhelming in terms of, the effect on kids. So our hope in this situation is that we're going to limit that. Again, this is very much analogous to sort of the alpha schools that we're taking a lot of inspiration from. And how do we compact that schedule from what is normally a 6 to 8 hour day into 2 to 3 hours, depending on your age group, which will be very focused work with the machine, but that machine will kind of take you through the process and have a very deep, intimate, personal understanding of where you are in your academic journey. And then outside of that, you get outside of the screens and you get into the fun stuff like project work, music and sports and other things that will keep kids sort of diverse and well-rounded, as well as kind of being plugged into a community and a system in and of itself. So another thing we got to be very careful of is cognitive offloading. Again, some interesting reports are coming in. I think there was one out of China in terms of how the AI has been pushing down homework like 30 to 40%, but it's also been lowering the test scores by 20. That's the wrong direction. And part of that is because kids are starting to do offloading. We all do offloading. Like, I don't have phone numbers memorized anymore. I use my phone to do that. I rely fairly heavily on Google Maps these days, where I used to be able to just navigate with my internal compass. So we already do offloading, but this is an area where we're going to have to be very specific and careful on how we make sure we ensure critical thinking and reliance and independent judgment. So the AI really is more for inquiry. It's not for thinking. It's a stimulation. It's a challenge buddy. It's a sparring partner. It's somebody to give you some interesting information and have a deep and intimate conversation about what the meanings behind that actually are. So this one's also a really interesting concept. It's called the zone of proximal development, or the ZPD. So what you need is something that's hard enough to grow, but supportive enough to allow you to continue. And so there's like it's theorized about an 85% threshold of you should be able to understand and get about 85% of the questions. And then the next bit is where that will be a bit of a challenge. So it's easy enough to make sure you don't quit, but hard enough to feel like there's interesting challenge to continue piquing curiosity. One of the best examples I think I could probably think is back in the old school 80s days, where you had the Nintendo out and you were playing something like Contra, and that friggin' game was hard as hell. But it was interesting enough that you could just, when you died and had to reboot, you were like, okay, get back on it, and you pack back in and continue to whack away at it. That or say Metroid. Those were really good balances of things that were pretty challenging, but they were fun enough and interesting enough that you wanted to stick with it. So that's an interesting balance that we're going to have to try to figure out. And the other kind of key part, again, one of the areas you'll hopefully hear me keep saying is we're hoping this technology helps us make this more of a human process, is we're going to bake a lot of peer learning into this. So, and you go through this whole entire Pomodorian session. At each of the sessions, we will be bringing in some peer learning. So you'll be working with somebody in your particular class, or potentially somebody even remotely. And then we can have some really cool moments where you might be able to interact with some kids way outside your cultural norms, and do peer learning with somebody that's completely outside of what you would understand is in your sort of backyard or neighborhood, which I think is super exciting. We've got a ton of things in terms of a constitution on sort of what we believe. I won't bore everybody with this, but there's a number of things around having a fair bit of agency. This notion of how these sort of guardrails that are there to begin with, but over time we'll sort of strip those away and have people, essentially trying to use and think for themselves as much as possible. Obviously, it takes a village to raise a family, and similarly, it takes a number of people and care about people and kids to really make this system work. We are very much against the notion of this being like some online software solution that some kid's going to just fire up his bedroom and try to work through. That isn't the point. We believe that this will be a physical space. There will be a mentor in the room. There will be 15 kids that you'll be involved with in a particular pod, and there'll be multiple pods that you can interact with. So time reclaimed is a huge issue. So if we're able to push this very curated set of education into a 2 to 3 hour process, we then have a fair bit of time to work on other things. And those other things should be the passion projects that these kids are super excited about. And we should be able to open those doors and have people be able to navigate that space and really let those kids, become something that they are. So you'll hear that expression a lot in terms of what we're thinking philosophically. And none of this is possible unless, there is some parents plugged in and participating in the overall journey. So my hope from this is that we'll be more human, not less. All right, so the Embers model. So what we've built, this is where we can get a little bit nerdy. So hopefully there'll be some questions coming in. So I went down the rabbit hole of OpenClaw, and that's the harness that I've kind of built the current version of this. We will move that into probably a more enterprise-ready agentic system as we go. OpenClaw was the easiest and quickest thing to get us up and running. And as most of you guys know, in something like OpenClaw, you can set up a particular agent, and it has some real specific things. It has the ability to have a soul file, it has the ability to access and use tools with some level of autonomy, and it has the concept of memory. And all three of those things are being used in this system. So what I did was I aligned very much towards the IB. And so we have literally an agent for every single subject. So you have Helix, which is biology, you have Fig, which is math, and you have, Sage, which is philosophy. And we have all these different agents that effectively will work in the system. You'll see that a little bit later. They all have their own soul file. They all have a very curated sort of narration of who they are. It's a bit of a caricature. I kind of took the Pixar approach of kind of dialing it up to 11 in terms of the caricature. It's to make sure that these kids don't try to think of them as real people. So you're going to tell that it's a thing that helps you with math, and it's a little bit of a character, and I'm not going to kind of treat it like as an actual real human. I'll walk through some of that a little bit later when we get into the actual design itself. So how the actual learning system will operate. So again, the sort of Embers aspect is a small part of the larger part of the day. And there are a number of different elements that wrap this all up together. So you'll have the AI itself, Embers, and it's 41 agents bringing a kid through a 2-hour or 3-hour Pomodorian session of 20 minutes with 5-minute breaks. And the agents will regulate that. So if a kid's in flow and going over on a particular thing, then they'll kind of let that go on. And then you'll sort of, rob Peter to pay for Paul in terms of how you balance that time out. But that will be sort of managed by the agentic system. As I said before, there is a mentor in the room. So a mentor's job is to figure out what a kid is, struggling with or excited about, and pretty much fire that kid up. Like be a gateway remover of challenges. Like, how do you remove friction from that kid? How do you expose them to other kids? How do you expose them to other concepts? How do you sit down with them and work through other problems? To be the person there that they can lean on and learn judgment and other important things. There'll also be peers. We talked about that. So there's multiple different interesting research papers around the notion of when you teach, how much that actually ingrains knowledge, and how much a part of receiving something from a peer or somebody in more of a similar set, you're more open and receptive to some of those concepts. So that'll be a huge part of what we do. Another interesting concept is we're going to bake in a notion of deep experts. And so for each one of the actual subject classes themselves, there'll be a specific a defined expert that owns that. So say it's physics, there'll be a PhD in physics that will own the physics track. And you'll be able to set up office hours like we did in college. So you can book an hour of time with that particular individual. This is a real person. This isn't an agent. It's a real human. And they own the sort of pedagogy of that particular agent. So there's kind of a tight cohesion there. But for that first half hour, that real person will then speak to Embers and figure out what's going on with Eric and where Eric is kind of getting excited about stuff and where he's struggling. And then Eric, when you jump on to the actual session itself, you then kind of work through the challenges or problems you're working through for the next bit of half an hour. So the expert gets sort of tooled up to begin with, and then is able to really shape a formative conversation for that back of that half hour. So effectively, if we kind of come back to that analogy of the floor and ceiling, AI's main job is to do what computers do best, and that is to help, feedback loops and practice and repivot around a particular point and come at the thing over and over again until you can establish you have some level of mastery in it. But the humans get to do what they do best, and that's reading the energy and understanding curiosity and making the real connections when somebody's struggling with something, put a hand on the shoulder and just saying, hey, how can we figure that out? So AI is sort of building that floor, and then humans are basically letting the children break through that ceiling. Who's involved? All right. So myself, background, you already heard earlier. Sunil, dear friend, former CTO of a number of different startups, and sort of fellow nerd when it came to all this AI stuff. We started geeking out on a lot of this stuff, going way deep, and he was one of the guys out there that was really pushing the envelope, who I loved and trusted and appreciated, really trying to test the boundaries. And as we began to sort of talk in this, we really thought that there was an interesting opportunity where we can leverage some of these new paradigm shifts and try to make a real punch at something different. We've got a number of other folks that we have been collaborating over the years. And depending on funding and all that good stuff, I would love to bring in a bulk of these folks. It's not just a bunch of knuckleheads, though. We actually have been pretty fortunate to bring in some heavy hitters. So particularly Mr. Dear Tim Vieira, who runs BGA. So he and I have been in deep discussions on many occasions. I'm actually going to meet him next week and run him through some stuff. I'm actually holed up at the Unicorn Factory with Pedro. And Pedro is the one who's done Tumo, and he's done 42. I can nerd out on some of those if you guys haven't seen them before. They're incredible different programs. 42 specifically is really interesting. It's becoming the #1 software engineering school in all of Portugal. And they're pretty radical in the fact there isn't a single teacher in the whole entire school. It's all a peer-based system. And how that works is really fascinating. And I could kind of go into that, but that would probably derail our conversation. Goodminder, who's the head of the Lisboan, has been incredibly helpful. And my whole goal here, if we can pull it off, is the first pilot possibly happen at the Lisboan. They have tons of space. They have 80 kids in a school that can hold 1,100. So they've got 2 and 3 floors that are just walled off and nobody's using them. So we'd love to be able to tap into that if possible. Pedro connected me to Jose Escute, who is former head of United for a while and a couple of other schools. He's also deeply tied into the IB, which has been interesting. So leaning on him to figure out if there's some doors that we can open with that. Dr. Lipton is a psychologist and founder of a company here in Lisbon that talks about children and digital health. The reason I was really excited to kind of bring her on is her core group tends to be a little bit more technical skeptics and some folks who are probably a little bit nervous about AI. And so we're setting the company up such that we'll have a not-for-profit and a for-profit. And the not-for-profit will be an efficacy study run through that will kind of hope to go through and validate what we're doing and why that's making an impact and how that impact is sustained. Another dear friend of mine is close with a gentleman named Andrew Menches, who I've kind of pulled into as well. And he's at the University of Edinburgh. And so we're hoping to pull him in on some of this conversation as well. All right, so now I'm going to kick into demo. But before that, I'm going to pause for a second and just see if any of that makes sense, because I did run through that a little bit fast, even though I think we only got 6 or 7 folks here. Any questions? Anybody?
I think we have a question from Aaron that is asking, which Unicorn Factory location are you working from?
I'm at Timu.
Yeah,
I'm at Timu, so I'm basically in the Timu space. So if you're in the Unicorn Factory, give me a holler, and we can connect.
Oliver has also a question for you.
Yeah, just a quick one, just in terms of some context. What stage is this at? Is this like just a demo stage, or are you actually doing? Are you live with students?
No, so we're not live with students yet, but it's a little past demo stage. So we're in early prototyping. We've got I guess the best way to phrase it is we're at pre-seed. So the folks, Pedro and those guys, are probably going to be the first check-in. And so our hope is to get a reasonable, viable MVP up for fall, and I'd like to get the pilots kicked off in fall. And the goal is to do a 2-year pilot program, basically 6 big sprints. And with that will become that efficacy study on top of it. And on the back of that, there's hopefully a lot we can pivot out of. So after that 2-year efficacy study, we'll then go on for next race to actually do a physical space. So one of the things I'll kind of talk about when we do the demo is, if this becomes the operating system for a school, I think you radically rethink the architecture of what a traditional school would be. I think you move away from this notion of a bunch of boxes within boxes and rows of seats. I think you start thinking more about mindsets and where kids want to be in flow. So is there a collaborative space with whiteboards? Is there a quiet space where I can sit down and kind of get focused? And is there collaborative
That was
space
probably
for us
that was probably my second question, just to understand, is the idea for this to run as its own thing instead of school within its own environment, or separate on their own with kids, or is it a tool that schools will use?
So it is the first two and not the last. And it's interesting. We're getting a lot of pressure to say, hey, could we just bolt Embers into our current educational process? And this would just be a helpful tool for our teachers to leverage and use. I think that misses a little bit of the point of where we want to. I think to some extent, we need to blow up the current system. I think it's broken. And so I'm definitely more of the ilk of like the alpha school, where they just said, screw it, we're doing our own thing. This is the way it happens. We're going to reformat the day. We're going to completely realign and figure a different way. And we're going to put the kids in for this 2 or 3 hour period. And then it's freedom for the next period of 4 to 6 hours. And that's obviously structured in a way, but it's very different than every hour your bell rings and you move to the next class and get lectured at from a teacher at the head of the room. I think we're going to move away from that.
When you, Chad, when you say freedom, what does that entail? So it's just like recess playtime, or do kids have also workshops they can, like in Alpha School, where they can apply?
It's the latter. Actually, I'm catching up with. I think he was going to jump on today. There's one gentleman who's we're going to collaborate with. Well, hopefully there'll be multiple. But effectively, there'll be passion programs and projects that folks will do, and that will veer to a bunch of different sectors. There's a huge segment of folks that are just like very into sports. So there's a sports academy guy I'm going to go talk to, and this plumbs in really nicely for those kids who are often training and going to competitions, and how can they still do school and still focus on the thing like sports. You have the same paradigm when it comes to music. You have the same kind of paradigm we talked earlier about entrepreneurialism. So I think in the grander scheme, it'll start to niche down into particular spaces like that. But irrespective, as a plain vanilla version, there'll be a number of different things that kids are doing in that period of time that's structured, that is using the skills that they're learning in that 2 hour session and then putting them in practice. And those will be projects that you'll build. And the hope here is that you start developing your own portfolio. And that's really where that proof of work portfolio sort of concept comes from.
Got it. Thanks.
More questions?
Just a quick one from me. Thanks a lot for the demo so far. But you have the system looks like it's individualized or maybe in small groups. My question is more about what happens with the social aspect that education and schools bring to a kid's education.
100%. So that's exactly it. So for that 2-3 hours, it's very personalized to the actual individual. And not only that, like, again, when you start thinking about the long time horizon, like if you get embedded into the system, it's not only going to know you personally right now, but it's going to know you for the last 2, 3, 4, 10 years that you've been doing it. So that becomes this accumulative knowledge that you can compound in really interesting ways. But again, that's a pretty tight little spot in that whole day of the 2 to 3 hours. The rest of it is smacking against other kids and going to science lab and hitting the resets and doing sports and all the other things that you need kids to get involved with from a social standpoint. Like that is something that I think it's too easy to dismiss from some of these ed tech solutions, is that what I don't think is broken about schools is the social aspect. I think that's great. Like even silly stuff like getting your ass kicked is probably a pretty good little life lesson. Like these things have to happen. Like it's part of what happens of just smashing kids together. So that I deeply want to keep. But what this gives you is some flexibility. So again, like you take that example of the kids who are doing sports. He's got a tournament in Barcelona for next week. He's going to go to Barcelona. He can still patch into Embers. He can still do the work he's trying to do. He can still bring in some peers from the class while he's working on some stuff. There are many different ways that they'll still kind of stay plugged in, but he's in Barcelona on a football pitch for a good portion of that week. And then when they come back and then reintegrate into schools. And then what can get really interesting, and this is one of the conversations we're having with Artemis, is Artemis has 13 schools globally. So you might do a term here, and then you might move to a new city for a term. And then you can be able to kind of transfer and move from those different places, but still be plugged in to the pedagogical pathway that you're working towards. And you might join a new pod, but you can still be connected to your old pod. So again, there's a lot of like flexibility and mobility in having the ability to be, offline or online at particular points, but definitely having a home-based ground space where kids predominantly come to sub-level, aka what BGA are doing and what Alpha does, I think is a huge and important part of what we're trying to build.
Awesome, thank you.
Anybody else?
All
right.
Yeah.
I'll do some demo. Let's do some demo. So caveat, I had a little bit of issue with my VPS host provider beforehand, which is now throttling on my CPU. So this might be a little bit slow, but we'll give it a kick and we'll see what happens. Other caveat is, Ollie, to your point, like we're not at full-fledged product yet. So we're definitely just playing and shaping and smashing some things around. So it is at prototype stage. With the view to get this in pretty decent shape within the next couple of months so that we can put this in front of a real group of anywhere from 15 to 30 kids in fall. Now, I'm not in any delusion that the system isn't going to totally fail us on many occasions. So I think for this first year, we'll probably have to double up on the actual humans that are involved in this situation so that we can pick up stuff when stuff goes wrong. But the whole point of it would be to then really just test the crap out of that, and when those breaks happen, we all kind of smash it together and figure out how to patch and move this thing forward as a big interesting experiment. All right, so before I get into it, there's going to be kind of three different core views. There's going to be the view that you're going to get as a kid. All of this data that you see here is my kids, so I went through and grabbed all of the report cards from all of my kids through all the different years and have plumbed it in. And so the system, even on that crappy little bits of like, we get one little report card every term or whatever it was, even on that small subset of information, it's pretty scary how well this thing knows each of my kids and what it will respond to as you're sort of playing with it. So there'll be a kids view, there'll be a guardian view, call it a guardian view, not a parent view, partly because of my grandparents' story, but partly because my hope here is that there might be multiple people that want to kind of jump on board the kids' academic journey. That might be an older brother or a cousin or an aunt or whoever it wants to be. There's ways that you can plug in, and I'll show you why that gets interesting. And then there's an advisor sort of view, which is the mentors in the class and the deep subject matter experts. So I'm in my view right now. So I'm going to kind of that's probably not the best way to go through the demo is to show the parent view first, but that's what I'm going to do because that one's one of the best possible ways to sort of narrate the story. So as I said, this is each of my kids as it is right now. So I've got Maya, it's 14 in year 9. I got Sasson, it's 11 in year 6, and Escher, it's in year 4. And these right here are the teachers that they are actually involved with at the Lisbon currently. And then the IB has a thing called ATLs, which are things like mirror, which is something that helps you reflect on what you did, or voice, which is how you can actually project and use your voice and be strong and what you're trying to do. They have a bunch of different subsets of things that allow kids to kind of frame academia in some slightly different lights. So we sort of included those as agents as well as the core fundamental agents. At the top dashboard, Embers, who's the kind of the Dumbledore of the system, you can ask him at any point in time, how can I support my daughter in mathematics or whatever else? And these should change and sort of adapt on a fairly consistent basis as you're playing around with, as you're kind of going through the system. So then we'll dip down. And then we're going to get into what is Maya's full academic career. So again, I've got everything in here from even her nursery. I've got some funny little report cards from her nursery, all the way up to, parts where we got into COVID and, ruining my poor kids through COVID. I was possibly the worst teacher ever. All the way up into her moving into that school I kind of shared, Mossboard Vicky Park, and some of the challenges happening there, and then down to where we moved here to Lisbon. And so I'll use this as an example. So we'll go into year 9. When I'm in year 9, that's sort of broken down by each of the different terms. So you got your autumn, you got your spring, and you got your summer terms. And then on the left-hand side, you have essentially got each of the different agents that are responsible for Maya for that particular period of time. And so through here, you've got basically the weeks as you go through. And so I move down into, we'll go spring down into here, and then you move down into the days through those weeks. And then if I move down into an actual day itself, you land on sort of a kid's week. And on a kid's week, this is where the kid has a fair bit of autonomy and ability to shape his workload or her workload however they want to. So again, we want to put a little bit of responsibility on these kids and say, you're kind of managing your workload. And if the kid comes in and doesn't want to do math on Monday, but wants to move that to Tuesday or some other day, then they can kind of shift when they want to move that around. And there's some rules and requirements that you've basically got to do 4 things a day, but how you do those 4 things, you can kind of shape and shift and change a bit. So this gives folks a fair bit of ability to really sort of change and alter how they want to approach a particular day. So then you're going to go down into an actual session itself. I got another demo I'll show you on what that actually looks like, but I'll just talk this one through. So Embers will come in, and Glow, one of the agents, will do a little check-in and say, hey, Ollie, how are you doing today? And you'll kind of give an idea of where you're at. You may share that you had a football tournament on the weekend and you're feeling a little bit tired. And so all that information is sort of then ingested and then handed off to the next agent as you kind of go through the system. Again, though, you have the ability to move that stuff around. So I might want to move into do something different. I don't want to do Portuguese third. I want to start with Portuguese before I move into anything else. So let's say we go into Byte. And so then we're going to kind of run into the substrate that will be the learning surface. And again, there's another demo that'll show this a little bit better. This was a slightly older version, but you can imagine it's going to be a bit like a Miro board where there'll be effectively sort of the educational material or knowledge tree on the left, and then there'll be the space of where you're actually working through some of the skills, and then you'll be agents that you can have the conversation on the right, and then there'll be some tools in the middle that you'll be able to leverage and use. So when this fires up, the agent comes up and it knows that it's the parent and not Maya. And so it's speaking to me. And it's like, welcome back to computing. And it's talking about Maya. And we're focusing on AI concepts today and building along with strong visual spatial reasoning and grasp, blah, 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 blah. And it basically it's sort of poking me to say, what is it that you'd like to help Maya with in terms of AI concepts for this particular course? And so then me as a parent, I can have a conversation with that thing and kind of say, I really like to understand this better, or where she's struggling, or what can we build on? But these agents also have the ability to pull in other agents. So I can pull in Iris, who's a visual agent, and I can say, Iris, my daughter likes to think visually. How best can we look at AI concepts from that standpoint, or whatever you want to say here? And then boom, that then fires off to the sub-agent around that. Iris gets all excited. She's like, oh, great, I get to talk about art. And there's like, oh, no, I'm not talking about art. I'm actually talking about computing, and I'm not even talking to Maya. I'm talking to Maya's dad. Okay, Maya's dad. Here, pragmatic ways, should be 4, got the numbering wrong, but you get the gist. Here are some ways that you can sort of think visually about looking at some of these concepts, right? And so you can kind of get that mix with a bunch of different things. Say we're doing history, and I want to bring in Sage, which is our philosopher. And you can sort of just smash these different sort of deep concepts around each other and really hash through a particular concept or idea of whatever it is you're sort of the key core topic of learning for that day. These things help sort of smash that around in a bunch of different ways that you can kind of get interesting on what that actually is. So you can see how that sort of spirals out. So that's the parent view. And then, like I said, if you come into the actual child view, they're going to come and land in, that week view set down into the actual Pomodoro session. Those will be their main views that they're operating in. They can navigate back up the tree if they want to and pop into, 3 weeks ago, there might have been a project they were working on that they want to go jump back into. It's easy for them to do that. But effectively, we'll kind of take them down to jump into the Pomodoro session. I'll show you that in a second, another version of that. And then the mentor view. So this one is, again, how we leverage the system to be as helpful to the mentors to really have the cues and pertinent information for what the kids are doing. So as a mentor, I've got 15 kids. I want to kind of know who's struggling, and it goes, okay, so Emma was really struggling in math. So she was showing some low joy on that. So how do I go in and get Emma fired up about that? Or Amari was, low engagement in science for the last 3 sessions. So at any point in time, I could jump into one of the agents and ping that agent up and say, hey, Amari's had a bit of a rough go. Let's give some easy wins today and let them sort of build some confidence and sort of prime that agent for when he does come into that session that they can sort of take over and run from that. Likewise, I can flip it around and find out Anus is doing really amazing and she's really enjoying Portuguese. So maybe me as a mentor go, hey, cool, I'm going to go grab her a little book on poetry from Portuguese and hopefully inspire her with that. What are the ways I can leverage this and get her excited about projects she might want to go do, or put her in touch with another kid who's doing something similar where they can kind of work together on something. So this data should be helping the mentors be incredible at what they do and do best, which is that real human connection. Like, it's giving them the right information to kind of probe and ask. Question, Steve.
Sorry, I hope I'm not interrupting your flow, but just a thought.
No, please.
Specifically when you're looking at students who might be struggling, is there a way to link students to each other, one who's good versus one who's awesome?
100%. So yeah, so exactly. So again, that mentors, that's kind of their role. It's like, I know Thomas is over here is crushing fractions. I'm going to smash Thomas and Sally together for this session at the end of the Pomodoro. Yeah. Ollie.
Yeah, no, just like, obviously this is sort of the project management interface of the curriculum or whatever in the students, but what does a kid see? Because, the user interface to how the kid learns, what they visually see is the most important thing. And probably the most difficult thing. That changes with age, right? I'd love to see that. So yeah, thanks.
I'll show you. It's a rough prototype. It's a little bit busy. It's around math, but you're right. For every single subject, it'll be different. So for history, it'll probably be some interesting videos that bring history to life a little bit. For stage and art, it'll be probably story narration and telling deep stories. So like for math, it'll be working through, the stuff. So it'll sort of change. And this is what I think Alpha do a pretty good job of. They're like, how can I go find the best sort of resources that are out there on the internet that describe this particular concept that we need to do better than anybody else and smash them into the system. So back to the system experts, that'll be partly their job as a curator, is that they'll be responsible for bringing in, okay, I gotta describe Newtonian physics in a way that gets kids excited. So what is the best way to do that? And then over a period of time, we'll have multimodal sort of assets around that. We may have some reading material. We may have some videos. We may have some interactive things you play with. And then depending on what you're learning specifically, so my kid's really dyslexic, so he's probably going to gravitate more to the audio and the visual sort of stuff as opposed to some of the reading stuff. So we can sort of adjust and pivot around that over time as well. But I'll show you that in a second. Real quick, I want to just kind of talk about the differences in how the sort of telemetry, what we're calling telemetry, which is kind of like the grades. So if I go into Maya, and I'm coming in now as an advisor, when I kind of mouse through these things, you get a much deeper breakdown of what the kids are looking at, and a couple of the areas that we're looking to understand and get an appreciation for is bubbled up into 3 core areas, which is mastery, engagement, and joy. And those are broken down into a subsequent set. And this will be fully like wrestled and will probably change. But right now it's trying to identify things around the conceptual understanding, the cognitive engagement, that intellectual agency, some judgment that you're doing, joy, and social intelligence. And so in the background, when you're working with these agents, they're sort of committing this stuff to memory over those working sessions, and that's what gets bubbled up in this look and view. And so the hope with this is you want to bring these colors from cool colors up to bright colors, and that's sort of how you navigate it. So if it's a parent, then the parent starts getting a slightly different view. Actually, let me go back into Sasson, and we'll go down into year 9. And so, in here, you kind of see the different coloring vase. But for a parent here, I'm seeing, agency, engagement, and joy is kind of a smaller, tighter set. And then, maybe a big call out here, and then something I can ask Embers about that particular day or week or whatever it would be. And then if you're a kid, you're going to see an even different sort of set. Where it's going to be, you asked a great question the other day, and so it's not going to be feeling like they're being, fully monitored on every single pivot that they're doing. It's trying to encourage them in ways that makes them feel comfortable about what they're trying to do. All right, I'll pause there for a second, and then I'll jump into the next session. Any other questions?
I think Artyom Projects has a question.
No, I think it was left up from the last time. I'll take my hand down. Sorry about that.
Sorry. Go ahead.
All right, cool. So, Ollie, this kind of gets back to your thing. So let me reboot this. So this is where the first phase, and it was literally the weekend that Fable came out. I smashed this together, and then Fable crapped out on me, and then I had a number of different things that I needed to jump to, and so there's a lot that we need to fix here. But effectively, as I said, Glow is going to come and do a little bit of a check-in and say, "Hey, good morning, Sasson. How you feeling today? Okay, my battery's feeling pretty good. I'm feeling a little foggy though. I got my brain's moving a little bit too fast. I got kind of a head full of some stuff. But am I ready to go? I mean, I think I am, maybe with some help, or no, I'm not ready, or yeah, I'm ready to go." And however we respond to that will then tee in the mentor, and the mentor can kind of get involved in different ways. And we can also pivot how you move into that next session. So say, boom, we're ready. So then it will do a little bit of assessment and play that back and say, cool, well, all right, here's where we're at. We're going to go step by step. Is there anything else you need or want to kind of cue into? And then you'll go, okay, no, I'm ready to go. Let's jam into it. And so then we're going to come into an actual math session. And I'm just literally going to I've got a dink double play sort of demo mode that I'll go through. But Fig will effectively, as I was working through a couple of teachers, one of them was Sasson's teacher, Sam, and she was kind of talking about how she was structuring just a simple sort of set around fractions. And so essentially there's this notion of kind of reviewing some things that you've done before, and then introducing some core new concepts, and then having a couple of worksheets that people want to go through. And then off of the back of that worksheet, you either progress further because they get it, or they get some problems, and therefore you got to rebuild on some core concepts. And then she brings in some peers, and they work together on some topics. And then that's a wrap. And that's kind of like what you do. And so we're sort of building some similar stuff along those lines. Again, this will be much more playful, a little bit more engaging, but it's just kind of trying to wrap through how the agent handoff and how that communication would happen. So we'll go through, and there was a bunch of different questions that Sasson would kind of go through and figure out. And then we'll look at some of the new territory. And so then it was sort of describing what that new territory would be. And then it would build on some of those concepts if you had some challenges with that. Boop, let me redo that. Boop, boop. Bink. Bark. Deep. Beep. Beep. You get to the new concepts. Then the peer will come in, and then they'll kind of work on some stuff together. So her avatar will come in and your avatar will come in, or you'll be actually off in another space. And so another thing that I kind of haven't really talked much about, but I should have, is we're looking at some multimodal ways of doing this. I don't know if everybody's seen the Remarkable, but we're trying to get things that everything you do within this system, you can kind of either print it out on physical paper, or it's obviously in the system itself. Or it's on something like a Remarkable, where you can kind of get the feel of like a real sort of simulation of what it is. And so this is like the exact same sort of structure of what the questions are asking it. It's on the Remarkable, so then I can go sit down with my friend Naya, and we'll sit down and kind of smash some things together as we're working on through it. And that's all being captured by Embers, because Embers is able to kind of read what was on the Remarkable or not. So then you'll kind of wrap up that particular session. And then this would be what the actual mentor would kind of get in terms of the process of where that individual was as they were working and thrashing through some stuff. And then, like you said, Ollie, that's going to change based on subject. So if you move through reading or different things, we'll have a totally different interface that we approach to that. But then you'll come back after that session, and then you'll get that question around that ZPD. Was this too easy? Was it just right? Or just whatever? So I don't know, it was too easy. Cool. Log in that. And then the whole system locks. And the system locks for the 5-minute break. And you can't really do anything. So it's going to say, get up, go stretch your legs, go talk to a friend, come back to us in a second. And only then after you come back can you start into the new session, and then come back and how was that, and then move into the new session, so on and so forth. And you'll do that for your period of time, and then you're done. And your work has sort of been wrapped up and tackled. All right, I'll pause there. Loads to do, but that's sort of where our head's at. All right. I'll wrap up a little. All right.
It's thanks for sharing. Like, that is such a hard vision to deliver on, right? I think
Indeed.
the data layer looks really cool. I think like the 3 areas that stand out for me are like trying to get the structural environmental part right. I've got 2 parents who are both head teachers of primary schools throughout their career, and I know how hard that bit is. That's probably the biggest, hardest part of a school, and probably the most important. I think a few people have touched on that sort of social interaction, that, just getting kids to do stuff. And then you've obviously got the compliance layer, whether it's sort of dealing with education systems and across different countries and all of that kind of thing. And then you've got the tech delivery, right, UI layer. It's almost like to get the best possible visual UI delivery, you've got to build the best Duolingo for every single topic, subject to engage the person or the kid in the best way. And then that changes how, as they grow older, a different UI for a 7-year-old compared to a 13-year-old, right? So challenging. But the vision's an incredible vision, but it just strikes me as a very, very difficult one to deliver on effectively, right?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent. When you've been grinding this sort of stuff out for a while, to the nth degree you're talking about, it's going to be a hell of a lot of work. But I think you can grow into that. I mean, Alpha, their stuff was basically ripped off Khan Academy stuff forever. and they were still smashing it with some pretty impressive numbers in terms of how, kids were being able to take that knowledge and really demonstrate it from some levels of mastery. And that was just on kind of hacked videos and a couple smashed out, widgets from Khan Academy. So yes and no. I think 100% it's to get it to where I want it to be in terms of being super adaptive, and to really sort of play into something like Google did some really impressive stuff around, you feed it a textbook and it creates a really interesting interactive substrate surface to play with. Like, we can get to that point, but if the beginning is just a pretty coherent sort of video and some worksheets around that, and then you can actually engage in a pretty interesting Socratic kind of question to sort of unpack some of these ideas, I still think that's better than what most kids are getting now anyways. And then that's just the foundation of what you can build on. But totally get you. There's a lot to bite off.
Right.
Cool. All right. I'll just spin through the last bits. Time, talent, and treasure. That's kind of how I close out the ask for this. Obviously, we're looking for some folks to get involved in terms of the pilot. We've got a growing group of folks that are interested. So if you know parents that are, open to sort of exploring some of these things and want to kind of be in on a ground level of building kind of exactly what we were just talking about, Ollie, and what that experience could inevitably be. And that's definitely something we're after. Definitely looking for talent. So mentors and designers and psychologists and all the sort of crew that is going to need to be running a school. We're going to need those folks. And then obviously we're looking for some cash. So like I said, we've got a pre-seed kind of in flight with a pretty standard safe right now. The folks from Temu and those guys are going to be the first check in. And then we're going to build off the back of that. And then I think in the fall, we're going to need to do a slightly chunkier raise to actually support, that 1 to 2 year pilot. And that'll probably be anything in the range of, a 980 to a 1.5, maybe even a 2 to 4, just to kind of round it out. So how that happens yet, still got a lot to get to make sure that gets to where it needs to go. But that's probably the ask that we'll be looking for. Bada bing. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. I think I've droned on way too long.
No, but it was necessary, man. It's
very good.
project, so it was really good. I'm super impressed, and so hopeful for the new generation and our kids. And like Ollie said, this is a big it's a big challenge, man. But you guys,
It's a beast.
and I also would say that there isn't a better time to do this than right now. Also in terms of content. So yeah, super impressed.
Totally.
Really. We got some questions here, Eric.
Yeah, what is the legality of this in terms of Portugal? Does it fall up under homeschooling or something like that?
So it's an interesting topic. Like, accreditation is a wild and woolly field in general. So I've been having some pretty long chats with the head of academics at the Lisboan, guy named Darren. There are multiple different ways you can sort of skin this cat. There are multiple different accreditation agencies out there. Cambridge is probably one of the more flexible ones. If we did go into the Lisboan as a pilot, there's the option and potentiality that we could kind of just nut in underneath their accreditation. There's also the way that Alpha is playing it, where they're playing it with, you can piggyback off of some of the US homeschooling sort of ways that allow you to do that. So there's a number of different venues that we've got to just unpack and figure out what the best and least friction approach is. Ideally, where my head's at is I love the IB, and so I want to get as deeply entwined into IB as possible. I think they've got a great pedagogy. I think they have a vast amount of incredible content that you could just, if you could just bring that to life a little bit, then you've got most of that problem solved. That'll be a process, and it'll take money. So like licensing IB stuff is super expensive. So that's one of the conversations I'm having with Jose is, what are some ways that we can edge around that for the first year. There'll be some ways that we can limit that. But you look at, poor Tim, like he still is only recently just getting some of the accreditation stuff for VGA in Portugal. Like I think he's accredited almost in he's there in 35 countries around the globe. And the only one that's giving him trouble is his home country. So they've been struggling with him for a while. Also, Portugal has a really interesting thing around specifically homeschools. If you want a Portuguese version of a homeschool, it has to be the specific Portuguese curriculum. So there's a minefield of stuff to navigate. But luckily, there are smarter people than I that will help navigate that space.
Chad, I think it's a great idea. I had a question about what your general thinking is about subjects. Reason is you brought up two sort of contrasting topics: physics, which obviously is a general subject and universal across the globe and the universe. But then history, in my experience, it tends to be quite subjective, especially in the country that you grow up in. So how do you tackle subjects like that when you ultimately have free reign over any subject matter?
Yeah, so this is where I hope the subject matter experts are going to come in and lend a little bit of their human judgment and their curative sort of thumb. So if somebody comes in as, when we find that sort of system level expert of history, like hopefully you pick a historian that is aligned with your values, that can look at world events in a way that's fair and based and pragmatic on kind of two sides, but has a story that they want to tell. And their job is really going to be how they curate that sort of lineage from the pedagogy. So we've got some basic stuff we've done now. I've underpinned it again with IB. So everything that I've got in the system right now is sort of taken from an IB seed, and then sort of develops the narrative off the back of that. But I think you need to go a much level deeper. And so for each of the agents, so for like history, you've got a description on the soul file of what that history person is, and then you've got sort of what the pedagogy is that you want them to look at, and then we've got other things in terms of just like explaining what the so here's an example of Fig. So Fig is our mathematician, and so you kind of describe what they are. And then you get into, all right, here's what you sound like, here's how you answer questions, here's your pedagogical roots. So, you set and define for each of these sub-agents what those can be. And then again, the deep level system expert is going to come in and help curate that and make that repository and library of content just become richer.
Great. Thanks a lot, man.
Yeah.
Chad, you mentioned the physical space of the school would be a lot very different from a normal school. I'm so curious to how you envision that. Can you?
So there's two things I'll reference. One is, if any of you guys get a chance, like ping me and come down to the Unicorn Factory, and let me just walk you through Tumo. It's an incredible space. And when you get to watch these kids come in and just like smash together and do stuff, it's pretty inspiring. I also take a huge dip from a group called IDEO. I really love them. Back in the agency days, they were somebody I always looked up to and respected. The way they divvy up a studio space is really interesting. They tried to think of it in modalities of how you're going to think. And so they would have kind of the war room or the public space, which is just a room with a whiteboard where you put everything up and you're really thrashing through stuff and you're sort of just working in a collaborative sort of environment. You're loud, it's messy. And then there's like little booths that you go to and that you're having a deep quiet time where you're kind of working. Or the desks themselves were the hybrid spaces where you had mobility stuff where you could move stools around and kind of have like on the spot sort of smash sessions, and then yet you could kind of sit back and still be at your desk and kind of have some level of focus. So that's the way I want to see these spaces is shaped around what the mental model of that person's going to be. So again, I referenced my boy Sasson. He's super dyslexic, so audio is probably going to be a big, huge part of what he does. And he's probably going to go away with the remarkable and have a thing in his ears and sit on a beanbag and kind of work through some of that stuff. And so he'll need a little bit more of a quiet space to kind of have that happen. So that's the vision that I'd love to have, is this collaborative space that really kind of change zonally based on what the needs of that particular kid are. We'll have those little pods of 15 people. So like it'll be 15 pods and you'll have multiple pods in a space. And I think we'll probably cap it at like that 150 mark. As the rule goes, if a group is more than 150, then it's hard to have relationships and connections with anything outside of that. I think that's potentially one of the ways we would want to split it. But that's sort of where our heads are at.
Thanks. Anyone else, guys? Questions for Chad?
Steven, I missed the increased Zoom, bud. Sorry about that.
It's okay. I just made it bigger on my side. It's my eyesight.
Cool. Anyone else? Any questions? I'm actually wondering, Chad. You mentioned peers, and I think that's really inspiring, both for the younger kids and the older kids also, to be able to teach the younger kids. Where do you see, and I'm sorry if I missed this, you probably talked about it, but where do you see teachers, like human teachers here? Where are they included? What is their role?
So again, the mentor in the room is the sort of the sage person you go to when you need a soundboard or you need to hash through something. And so in every pod of 15 folks, there'll be one mentor. And you're going to come in as a kid, you're going to be setting your own schedule, you're going to do your Pomodoran session, but you're also going to be doing project work. And all of that will be orchestrated and sort of facilitated by that mentor. And so there's a company in Phoenix called, I think it's called Prequel. And the gal's actually here in Lisbon, the CEO, and she spends probably 70% of her time hiring. And what she focuses on is kind of the hiring of these mentors. And what she's really interested in is how good these people are at motivating and exciting and getting kids fired up and how they can tell a story. And so this mentor role, I think, sort of shifts a little bit from potentially in a more traditional school, you might have had a math professor that was really, really, really amazing at math, but was absolutely shit at dealing with kids and people. And so, maybe there are 2 or 3 kids that he got along with, but everybody else sort of just took the lumps and tried to get through algebra class as best they could. And in that system, you kind of needed that because you needed that level of expertise in math. In this world, I think you flip that a little bit. I think you over-index on EQ. And these mentors are people that should be teaching kids how to best use judgment and how to empathize and getting them excited and fired up about stuff. So I think you skew more towards that group of people. And again, like I think BGA is a pretty good example. There's some interesting mentors there. I think Temu is a pretty good example. It's like watching those mentors fly around with the kids is pretty fun. So I think that's the way you head, and that's the role of the mentor, is to kind of do these deep dives in the dashboard, figure out where John and Eric and Thomas are at, and figure out how you can unlock wherever they're getting stuck and blocked. So you go home at night like ruminating on that. Like, I don't know why, but Sally just is stumbling in math right now, and I gotta figure out how to unlock that. And that's your role in life to some extent. And so if that means
I guess they'll have more time to think about things like that instead of just stressing around and having a curriculum they have to run through, and they'll have more time for the individual.
It's interesting because I was talking to Sam, Assassin's teacher, and she teaches 6th grade, and she's got a group of kids, and the kids are a little on the spectrum. And when I was walking her through this, like, she was just like, holy crap, like this would allow me to just like deep dive into these kids' lives and like really pull the stuff out that I want. Like this system handles all the bullshit that takes most of my time.
Exactly.
And then I can just focus on actually engaging in that child's life. And so like, I think that's where inevitably, like, ironically, I hope this technology almost makes us more human in a way, because we can really spend time on the actual important stuff of making eye contact and really talking to a kid, really seeing a kid and having some time to really listen to what their hopes, fears, and dreams are.
Absolutely. I think AI will make us more human in many aspects. And it sounds weird, but I think AI has taken away all that bullshit that we have been learning that is just trash in our brains that we don't need, right?
100%.
So for teachers and schools, this is, this is just such a big step forward, and I really hope that that you'll be able to implement this quick and get your money and let's go.
Let's go.
Because I don't know if we're all parents here, but I mean, my kids go to public school, and I'm constantly just disappointed with 90% of the things that happen in the school, including the teachers, because the teachers only have one way of teaching. And if a kid is not aligned with that way of teaching, he's just lost. And this lets kids also decide how they want to teach, how they want to learn. And that's the big differentiator here. I feel that kids can actually learn the way they want at their own timing and level. So yeah, man, congrats. Thanks,
man,
for doing this.
Appreciate it, guys.
Yeah.
Well, you guys know where I'm at. If anybody's got any questions or wants to jam or wants to come to Temu or wants to give it a good kicking, like constructive criticism, super welcome. Like, we're gonna need a lot to make this thing go. And so the more you guys dump in, the better the chances we have. So thank you all for making the time on a Wednesday night till 10 o'clock. You all are angels. Appreciate it.
Worth it. And thanks, Chad, man, for taking your time to explaining what you're doing and inspiring us. And to everyone else, thanks for coming. These night sessions have really been inspiring, and I hope you also feel inspired, and I hope you keep coming. Because that's what makes it worth it for us to continue organizing these sessions. So thanks a lot, guys. And Chad, I'll pin you next week so we can.
Yeah. Let's grab that lunch, dude.
Yeah, let's do it.
Thank you, Chad. Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Chad. Very cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Bye bye.
Hey.
Thanks, everybody. Ciao, ciao.